Wild dog! The word cracked across the sunlit street like a whip, and 20 voices barked it back until it sounded less like an insult than a verdict. She did not fight, did not rise. She folded her arms across her ribs and tried to make herself smaller on the hot dust. Hair a tangle, dress torn at the hem, lips chalk dry from days with nothing but pump water, and pride. A boy lobbed a crust at her as if tossing scraps to a stray, and the blacksmith's wife laughed the way people do when cruelty feels like a carnival game. They called her a wild dog, and because hunger steals even the breath to answer, she let the name settle on her shoulders like a yoke. A boot came close, its shadow sliding over her cheek, when the crowd thinned in a ripple and a figure stepped into the ring they had made without knowing it. He was Apache, broad-shouldered, sun-browned. His hair braided and tied with leather, a sleeveless deerskin vest hanging open at the chest, and his walk said he had no need of anyone's permission to cross a street. He did not speak to them, or ask for space. He simply sank down beside her so that his knees met the dust, and the shock of that quiet movement drew the breath from the onlookers. The Apache simply sat, broke bread, and shared his plate. From a pouch at his belt, he drew a round of coarse bread, warm enough for steam to lift when the crust cracked in his hands, and he set half upon a tin plate and placed the plate between them as if drawing a circle no one else could enter. He took a bite first, slow and deliberate, his eyes on hers to show that nothing he offered carried poison or pity. Her fingers twitched, then stopped, then twitched again. She had forgotten somewhere along the road that handed her to this noon hour what it felt like to be given anything without a price. When she reached at last and her hand brushed the lip of the plate, something small slipped from inside her sleeve and struck the tin with a bright, surprised ring. It was a flat pendant, no bigger than a thumbprint, holed for a cord, stamped with a spiral and smudged with old soot, and it spun twice before settling against the bread, as if it had always belonged there. A murmur ran through the crowd, the kind of sound that says superstition is waking in the back row, and the sheriff's hand paused halfway to the butt of his gun. The Apache's chewing stopped, his eyes narrowing on the pendant with a focus so sharp the street seemed to shrink to the space between their knees. He touched the edge of the tin, and the plate stilled. And he said, very softly, as if to himself, a word that wasn't English and carried the weight of a name. Her head snapped up at the sound, and for a heartbeat a kind of fear, too complicated to be only fear, passed over her face. "Where did you get this?" he asked, the consonants careful, the vowels dark, and the question fell heavier on the scene than any insult that had come before. She swallowed and glanced at the ring of faces, as if choosing which stranger might have earned the right to hear whatever truth she carried, and then looked back to the bread as if the answer might be baked inside it. "From a woman at the river," she said, and the words were as thin as her wrists, "who told me to find the man who would share his plate." The blacksmith snorted and spat, but no one laughed, because the look that crossed the Apache's face was not mockery, not charity, but recognition, and recognition changes the weather even under a merciless sun. He lifted the pendant between finger and thumb and turned it so that the spiral caught the light, and a quiet traveled outward like a slow wave as a few people in the rear began to remember stories they had not told in years. Someone muttered that the mark belonged to morning, someone else that it bound a promise, and the sheriff, uncertain whether this was trouble or salvation, shifted his weight and failed to find an easy law to stand on. "What was her name?" the Apache said, eyes steady, voice still low, and the woman pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling and did not speak the name she had been given at birth. "I don't know her name," she whispered instead, "only that she said I had 3 days to give this back to the one it belonged to, or the river would take the rest of me the way it took the first part." At that, even the blacksmith's wife lost her smile. For there are sentences that fit too neatly over the shapes of grief, and this one slid like a lid. He set the pendant down upon the plate, again, beside the bread, and bowed his head for a moment that might have been a prayer, and might have been an old habit made new by pain. "Eat," he said, and the word was not an order, but an invitation into a circle where no one would permit a boot to cross. She tore a small corner from the loaf, held it between her fingers as if it might vanish, and put it to her mouth, and the taste, plain as it was, broke something hard inside her in a way laughter could not touch. The crowd, which had named itself by what it shouted, waited to see whether it was safer to cheer or jeer, and no one yet chose, because the first choice had already been made by two people on the ground. The sheriff cleared his throat. The deacon muttered a verse. A trader in a stiff collar whispered about bounties and old debts, and near the back a rider dismounted with the slow care of a man who did not want his spurs to tell the town he had arrived. Somewhere a fly buzzed, and the well rope creaked, and the Apache tilted his head as if he could hear something beyond the fence of noise. Before she could finish, a rider's rifle lever clicked, the sound crisp as bone. The crowd turned, and the pendant on the plate flashed in the sun, as if choosing whether it belonged to mercy or blood, for all watching. The click of the lever carried across the street like thunder trapped in steel, and the crowd's jeers folded into silence as every head turned toward the man who had just stepped from his horse. He was tall, raw-boned, his boots coated in trail dust, a wide-brim hat pulled low to shade eyes that were colder than the barrel he rested across his forearm. The woman's breath caught when she saw him, not because she recognized his face, but because something in the way the crowd shifted told her they did. Whispers rippled. "Kerrigan's back. I thought he'd hung in Tucson. No, they never could hold him." The name moved like smoke, filling the street, and the sheriff stiffened, though his hand stayed far from his holster, as if he already knew his chances. Kerrigan let his gaze slide past the townsfolk and settle on the Apache seated in the dust, on the bread split between plates, and then on the spiral-stamped pendant glinting atop it. His lips curled into something halfway between a sneer and a memory. "That trinket," he drawled, his voice as rough as mesquite bark, "was meant to be buried in the San Pedro with the woman who wore it. I paid good money to see it drowned." The woman flinched, clutching her arms tighter against herself, but the Apache's hand moved only enough to shift the tin plate closer to her knee, a silent wall drawn from inches of space. Kerrigan saw the motion and laughed once, sharp, joyless. "Do you even know what you're feeding, Redskin? They call her a wild dog because she is one, scavenging on scraps of grief that don't belong to her." The words struck like stones, but no one laughed this time, because Kerrigan carried a reputation that made even mockery feel like complicity. The Apache rose, smooth and unhurried, dust clinging to his knees as he straightened to his full height. For the first time, the woman saw his shadow fall over her, long and unbroken, a shield against eyes that meant her harm. He spoke low, but the words carried. If it belonged in the river would not have given it back. Kerrigan's hand shifted on the rifle, the threat implied rather than declared, but the tension it breathed into the street was enough to make a child cry near the back. The sheriff barked a weak order for peace, his voice cracking as though he were ashamed of his own lungs, and no one answered him. Kerrigan took one step forward, boots grinding stone into dust. "That pendant binds debts older than you, Injun," he said, and though his eyes never left the Apache's, the woman knew she was the true target, because predators do not snarl at stone walls unless prey crouches behind them. She wanted to speak, to tell someone, anyone, that the woman at the river had pressed the pendant into her palm with shaking fingers and whispered words that burned like prophecy, but her throat would not give sound. Instead, she felt the Apache's hand brush lightly against the edge of her shoulder, not a touch of possession, but of grounding, and the strength of it steadied the air in her lungs. Kerrigan noticed, and his smile hardened. "You can sit in the dirt with her, break your bread, share your plate, but when the sun drops, I'll take back what belongs to me, and if she's still clinging to it, I'll take her too." He slung the rifle back into ready position and swung into his saddle in a single motion, dust lifting in a bitter halo as the horse snorted. The crowd parted without a word. A living corridor that let him ride out as if he owned not just the street, but the fear that lingered on it. When he was gone, the silence he left was worse than his presence, because it was filled with questions no one dared ask out loud. The Apache knelt once more, lifted the pendant, and studied it in the sunlight as though it were not just stamped metal, but the edge of a map. He looked at the woman, his gaze unblinking. "You said 3 days," he reminded softly. She nodded, whispering, 3. He set the bread back into her palm and said only, "Then we will see if he is man enough to claim what the river returned." And though her hunger gnawed, it was fear, now, that chewed faster. By dusk, the whole town knew, because fear has faster legs than horses, and by the time lanterns burned in the windows of the saloon and the boarding house, every tongue in Dusthaven carried the tale of how the Apache had sat in the dirt with the woman they called a wild dog, had broken bread with her as though she were kin, and how Kerrigan, long thought gone to some outlaw's grave, had returned with a rifle and a claim that reached deeper than the river. In the boarding-house kitchen, women whispered over dishes, some spitting that the Apache had shamed them, others trembling because they had seen the pendant catch the light, and knew old stories whispered by their mothers about spirals that marked debts between bloodlines. In the saloon, men drank faster, their laughter thinner, because Kerrigan's name was like a nail-scratching glass, promising splinters no one wanted. The sheriff sat hunched at a table near the window, turning his badge over in his palm, as if wondering whether it still had weight enough to face the storm. And when asked what law could stop Kerrigan, he said none, though his lips moved as though they hated the truth. The woman, who still had no name to anyone but herself, sat within the quiet of a stable, knees drawn, bread clutched close though half already eaten, the Apache kneeling by the open stall door, as if his presence alone were enough to keep wolves from circling. He did not ask who she was, or why the river woman had given her the pendant, and she did not yet tell, because silence was safer than words, and the words she carried would bind him to her fate if she loosed them. Still, she could not forget the way he had spoken when Kerrigan claimed the spiral, the low certainty in his voice, as if he had heard its echo in dreams. A stable boy, no more than 10, crept close and peered wide-eyed at them both before whispering, "My pa says Kerrigan once burned a cabin just to see if folks screamed different in the dark." The boy's voice cracked on the last word, and the Apache's gaze softened only enough to nod and send him scurrying back, but the woman caught the message clear. The town was already bending under the weight of the outlaw's shadow. Outside, boots tramped, voices rose, and she pressed her face into her arms, wondering how much longer she could carry a secret that seemed to grow heavier by the hour. At length she whispered, "You don't know what you've done." And though her voice barely lifted above straw, the Apache heard. He looked at her, his eyes steady, his voice low as stone. "Then tell me." But she shook her head, lips trembling. Because the river woman's warning burned too sharp in memory, only the one who breaks bread with you can carry it. If he knows too soon, the debt will claim him instead of free him. So she said nothing, and he did not press, though the silence between them stretched taut as a lariat. Outside, a drunk shouted Kerrigan's name, and the crowd answered with a cheer that tasted of fear more than loyalty. and she knew the town had already chosen a side, just not hers. The Apache rested one hand lightly on the hilt of the knife at his belt, the other on the edge of the tin plate, as if to remind her that bread shared once could be shared again. And though the world outside conspired to brand her dog, in that moment she felt for the first time the fragile beginnings of what it meant to be protected. But protection is never free. And she wondered how long until he asked the question again, and how long she could keep from answering. Morning broke harsh and bright, the kind of sun that left no corner for secrets, and yet Dusthaven already buzzed with a secrecy thick enough to choke. Word spread that Kerrigan had not left town at all, but had taken a room above the saloon, his rifle leaning against the window frame where all could see it glint like a threat with every hour, and men who had sworn never to deal with him again now slipped through the bat-wing doors to murmur over whiskey, their laughter forced, their loyalty cheapened by fear. The sheriff made one slow walk down the street, his hand on his badge as if touch alone might give it power, but when he glanced up and saw Kerrigan watching from the window with a lazy grin, he quickened his step and did not come back. In the churchyard, women gathered with their baskets and muttered prayers that sounded less like hope and more like bargains with God, asking why a stranger girl and an Apache should drag curses into their midst. By the stable, where the woman crouched beside a water trough to wash the dirt from her face, whispers trailed after her, softer now but no kinder. Wild dog. Trouble magnet. She'll bring fire on us all. Yet no one dared throw stones while the Apache stood close, arms folded, gaze sweeping over the street like a hawk measuring the wind. He had not slept. She knew it by the way his eyes carried shadows deeper than dawn. Yet when she faltered, he was steady, and when she bent over the water, his presence kept others from drawing near. Kerrigan appeared mid-morning, striding with a confidence that made space before him, his boots echoing on the boards of the general store porch. He tipped his hat to no one, spit tobacco juice into the dust, and called out loud enough for every ear to catch. 3 days, Apache. That's what she said, wasn't it? 3 days, and that trinket's mine. You can sit in the dirt with her, share your scraps, play protector, but when the sun sets on the 3rd day, I'll take what belongs to me. Bread won't change the law of blood. He tapped the rifle against his boot and grinned, and the crowd, hungry for someone else to set the rules, laughed nervously as though agreeing might keep their own homes from burning. The Apache did not answer. He simply watched Kerrigan with a calm so complete it seemed born of another world, then turned his gaze to the woman, who felt her stomach coil tight because she knew silence carried its own weight, and soon someone would demand it break. That night, when the stable settled and lanterns guttered out, she whispered what she had not dared tell. The woman by the river, she said this pendant was never meant for me. It belonged to a man who lost everything, and if I found him, he'd know what to do. She said if I failed, the debt would eat me alive. The Apache took the pendant from her palm, studied the spiral in the lantern light, and though he did not speak, the set of his jaw told her the mark was not new to him. Outside, a coyote cried, long and mournful, and it carried through the thin night air like a warning. The woman wrapped her arms tight around herself and asked the question she dreaded. Do you know what it means? He turned the pendant once more, closed his fist around it, and met her gaze without blinking. I know enough, he said, and though he gave no answer beyond that, his voice carried a promise heavy as stone, that he would stand when Kerrigan came, whether the town liked it or not. The second day began with a storm, not of weather, but of whispers, and by noon the whole town had gathered in the saloon, where Kerrigan held court like a king whose crown was fear. He leaned back in his chair, boots crossed on the table, rifle resting in reach, and spoke of debts as though the street itself owed him tribute. The woman sat in the stable with her back to the wall, clutching the bread crusts that remained, her stomach twisting more from dread than hunger, while the Apache sat across from her, polishing the edge of his knife with movements slow, deliberate, as though he had all the time in the world. She wanted to ask again if he knew what the spiral meant, but before she could, the door banged wide, and the stable boy she had seen the night before skidded in, face pale, words tumbling over each other. They say Kerrigan's got proof it's his, that pendant. He's showing folks letters with names and seals, and he swears the girl's wearing the dead of his family. The Apache stilled, his hand pausing on the blade, and for the first time a shadow passed over his features that looked like recognition turned sour. The boy, shaking, went on. Said his brother died with that mark around his neck, and whoever carries it owes him blood or service till the balance clears. Said if the river gave it back, it's because the debt ain't finished. The woman's heart stuttered, because the river woman's warning rang louder than ever. 3 days, find the rightful owner, or drown in what was owed. She turned to the Apache, searching his eyes, and whispered, "Do you believe him?" He folded the knife, slipped it back into its sheath, and spoke with a weight that silenced even the boy's frightened breathing. "I believe the spiral is older than Kerrigan's lies." He opened his fist, revealing the pendant, its etching catching the faint light. "This is not a trader's seal or a brother's keepsake. It is a bond of protection, forged between my people and one man whose line nearly broke. Whoever holds it carries the last thread of that promise." The woman stared, the truth sliding into place with a clarity that froze her chest. "Then it was never mine to keep." He shook his head. "It was never his to claim." Outside, hooves struck the dirt, hard and angry, and the sheriff's voice rose, strained and hollow, announcing Kerrigan's demand that the girl and the pendant be brought to him before sundown. The boy whimpered, scuttling back into the shadows, but the Apache rose, his presence filling the small space like a wall against the storm. "He wants blood for a debt he does not understand," he said, "and a town too frightened will hand him anything to keep him from asking again." The woman pressed the bread to her lips, tears cutting through grime, and whispered, "Then what happens when the sun falls?" He turned to her, eyes dark as the river at night, and answered with a promise and a curse all at once. "Then we find out whether Dusthaven belongs to its dogs, or to those who still remember how to share a plate." By the third morning, Dusthaven no longer breathed as one town, but as two uneasy halves, each side watching the other with eyes sharpened by fear. One half gathered outside the saloon, rallying behind Kerrigan's promises of lawless order, men muttering that siding with him was safer than standing in his way, women clutching children close, while telling themselves that if they looked loyal enough, his wrath might pass them by. The other half lingered in doorways, at the church steps, near the blacksmith's yard, silent and restless, because they had seen what bread broken in the dust could mean, and though they feared the Apache as much as they feared Kerrigan, something about that small act gnawed at them, whispering that dignity shared could weigh more than threats shouted. The sheriff, caught between both sides, tried to call a meeting on the courthouse steps, his badge gleaming dull in the sunlight, but when Kerrigan himself sauntered up, rifle resting lazy across his shoulder, the lawman's voice cracked and scattered like dry timber in fire. Kerrigan grinned, his teeth bared like a wolf's, and he raised the pendant high, dangling it by its cord for all to see. "This spiral," he announced, his voice carrying across the street, "marks a debt older than this town. It was bound to my brother, and through his blood it falls to me. That girl stole it, or worse, and whoever protects her stands against my claim. You've got till sundown to deliver her and the Apache who hides her, or Dusthaven burns." Gasps rippled, some turning into hurried nods of agreement, others into mutters of defiance. Inside the stable, the woman pressed her face to her knees, hearing the roar of voices split by loyalty, her chest tightening with every shout. The Apache stood near the open doors, silent, his eyes scanning the crowd, not with fear, but with the cold patience of a man measuring where steel would strike if cornered. "They'll hand me over," she whispered, trembling, and the Apache looked down at her, the bread plate still beside them, though long emptied. "Not all of them," he said simply, and when she lifted her gaze, she saw a small cluster near the church, faces stern, lips pressed thin, but eyes not willing to bow. Among them the blacksmith's daughter, a boy clutching his mother's skirt, the deacon's wife. People who had no rifles, no law, but had seen what sharing a plate meant. Still, their silence was thin armor, and she knew silence alone could not stand against rifles and fire. "Why do you care?" she asked him suddenly, desperation leaking sharp into her voice. "You don't even know my name." He met her gaze, unflinching. "I know what they called you, and I know what I saw when you took the bread. That is enough." She swallowed hard, unable to answer because the words were heavier than any vow she'd ever been given. Outside, Kerrigan's laughter carried, mocking, claiming the town like a man brands cattle. The Apache reached for the pendant, closed his fist around it, and said low, "If the debt is mine, then let it be mine, but he will not have you." And though her heart lurched at the danger wrapped inside his calm, a small spark, fear's twin, hope, lit where her shame had lived, fragile but alive, waiting to see which half of Dusthaven would claim the night when the sun went down. The sun had barely tipped past its crown when the first shot split the air, a crack so sharp it tore the morning wide open. People scattered from the saloon porch as Kerrigan's rifle spat smoke, and a lantern hanging over the general store shattered into shards and flame, kerosene spilling like liquid fire down the boards. Screams rose, men cursing as they ran with buckets, women dragging children into alleys, and Kerrigan sat his horse in the middle of the street, grinning as though he had merely tossed dice on a table. "You think I'm bluffing?" he called, the words carrying on smoke and fear. "By sundown she's mine, or I'll burn every beam in Dusthaven till it glows like a funeral pyre." His horse reared, hooves striking sparks from stone, and the crowd scattered farther, some shouting that they should give the girl up, others yelling to fight, but no one stepping forward first. In the stable, the woman clutched the tin plate against her chest as if it could shield her from flames, trembling so hard her teeth chattered, while the Apache strode to the doors, eyes narrowed, jaw like carved stone. He did not rush, did not shout. Instead, he raised the pendant high, letting the spiral catch sunlight so bright it gleamed even through smoke. Kerrigan's grin faltered for the first time, his eyes narrowing on the mark as though it had leapt from ghost story into flesh. "You don't know what that means," Kerrigan growled, leveling the rifle. The Apache's voice was calm, almost solemn. "I know enough to end you." And then, for the first time, he turned to the woman, speaking low but clear. "Tell me the rest of what the river woman said." She shook her head, panic flaring. "If I tell, it binds you. She warned me." His gaze did not break. "It is already bound." Outside, townsfolk whispered, drawn by the power in his stance, the pendant burning like a brand in his hand. The woman swallowed hard, her voice breaking as she forced the words free. She said the spiral was carved when a village fell to fire, that the last man alive swore his bloodline would protect the lost until the debt was paid in full. She said it would return in hunger and in shame, and whoever shared bread with the marked one became the keeper. Her words carried farther than she intended, and the people nearest the stable doors gasped, crossing themselves, murmuring old fragments of stories they'd heard in childhood about promises no one dared break. Kerrigan spat into the dirt, rage burning hot across his face. Lies, pretty tales to make dogs into queens. He fired again, this time at the trough, water exploding into spray, horses screaming in terror. The Apache never flinched. He laid the pendant back into the woman's hands, covering it with his own calloused palm, and his voice was so steady it cut through the smoke. Then tonight we will see whether fire still owns Dusthaven, or whether bread does. And though fear churned through her bones, she felt it then, that the town itself had reached a knife edge, and whatever choice came next would slice its soul forever. By midday, the street itself looked like a battlefield without bullets, a line drawn invisible yet sharp through the heart of Dusthaven. On one side, the saloon porch sagged under the weight of men who had thrown their lot in with Kerrigan, faces tight with fear disguised as loyalty, rifles propped against knees and mugs clutched like talismans. On the other side, nearer the church, stood townsfolk who did not cheer nor shout, their silence heavy, but their eyes turned more often toward the stable than the outlaw's perch, as if waiting for something older than law to tell them where to stand. The fire from the general store had been smothered to smoldering embers, black smoke streaking the air like scars, and in that bitter haze Kerrigan rode up and down, his voice booming with threats, promising coin for betrayal, promising ash for defiance. Each pass he made the line of his men grew louder, yet each pass also drew another glance, another whispered word, toward the Apache's steady figure by the stable doors. He had not moved since morning, arms folded, braid stirring only when the smoke-sharp wind gusted, eyes locked not on Kerrigan, but on the crowd, as if he cared less for the outlaw's bluster than for the measure of those who watched. Inside, the woman clutched the pendant to her chest, the spiral pressing hard against her skin until she swore it might cut, her breath coming in shallow bursts. She had told him more than she was meant to, and the warning of the river woman rang still. If he knows too soon, the debt may claim him instead of free him. Yet what choice remained when fire already licked at the town's edge? She whispered through the cracks in the boards, watching shadows move, listening to children cry muffled into their mothers' skirts, and she hated herself for the thought that perhaps giving herself up would ease them all. But before she could let the thought bloom, the Apache's voice carried back to her, low, calm, unyielding. Do not mistake fear for wisdom. If you go to him, he will not spare them. He will only take more. The words steadied her even as terror gnawed, and she leaned her head against the stall wall, eyes closed, letting his certainty anchor her against panic's tide. Then, as the sun edged higher, the deacon's wife stepped into the street, clutching her shawl tight, and lifted her voice, shaking but clear. This town was not built on one man's threats. Bread was broken here yesterday. I saw it, and I will not call it shame. The saloon men jeered, Kerrigan's laughter barking sharp, but the sound had a crack in it now, because others shifted, unsure. The blacksmith's daughter joined, standing beside the woman, then the boy who had whispered of burned cabins, his small frame quaking yet defiant. One by one, slow but unstoppable, bodies drifted toward the church side until the line was no longer invisible but plain. Half the town beneath Kerrigan's shadow, half in the fragile shelter of silence and memory. Kerrigan spat into the dust, rage boiling beneath his grin, and shouted, "Then the fire takes you all, unless the dog and her redskin crawl out before nightfall." His horse reared again, his rifle glinting. The Apache finally stepped forward, his voice carrying across the divided street. "Then let the town choose which name it wants remembered, Kerrigan's fear or the bread we shared." And though the silence that followed was jagged as glass, it held something new within it. The first faint shape of courage, the moment of fragile courage shattered at sundown, when Kerrigan made good on his threat not with more words, but with fire and blood. He rode hard down the street, a torch in one hand, his rifle slung across his back, and flung the flame straight into the doorway of the deacon's storehouse, where sacks of grain waited for winter. The blaze leapt like a starving animal, orange tongues clawing skyward, and screams tore from throats as townsfolk scrambled with buckets too small to quench what rage had lit. When one man tried to stop him, stepping forward with a hammer raised, Kerrigan wheeled his horse and brought the rifle down with a crack across the man's skull, sending him sprawling in the dirt, blood painting the dust red. The sight broke whatever balance remained. Half the crowd surged toward Kerrigan, cheering madly to hide their terror, while the other half wept and dragged the fallen man away. From the stable doors, the Apache stepped out at last, his figure a dark tower against the firelight, and in his hand gleamed the pendant, its spiral glinting with each flicker of flame. The woman followed, trembling but upright, clutching the empty tin plate as though it were a shield. Kerrigan spotted them and laughed, a sound like steel tearing wood. There she is, the wild dog and the fool who'd sit beside her. Give her over, and I might spare the rest of you. Stand in my way, and I'll salt this street with your bones. His rifle swung up, the barrel aimed not at the Apache but at the woman, because he knew where to press the knife of fear. Gasps rose, a mother cried out, and for an instant she thought her legs might fold, that she would collapse into the dust and beg for mercy. But then the Apache moved. Swift and unhesitating, stepping between her and the barrel, raising the pendant high so the firelight caught it like a brand. "This spiral does not bind you," he said, his voice so calm it hushed the street. "It binds me. You call it debt. I call it oath, and I will pay it here." The words struck the air like a bell, deep and resonant, and something shifted in the watching crowd, as if old stories awoke in their bones, stories of promises kept when all else burned. Kerrigan snarled, furious at the crack forming in their fear, and pulled the trigger. The rifle roared, smoke bursting, but when the haze cleared, the Apache still stood, dust spraying at his feet where the bullet struck short, and his eyes burned into Kerrigan's with a fire steadier than any torch. The woman clutched the plate tighter, her tears gone to ash inside her, and whispered hoarsely, "You'll die for me." The Apache did not look back, his gaze locked on the outlaw. "Not for you, for what was promised." And in that vow she felt something far heavier than protection. She felt the town itself hanging on the edge of a blade, waiting to see whether fear or faith would draw the next breath. The gunshot's echo had barely died when the town itself seemed to hold its breath, every eye fixed on the two men facing one another in the bleeding dusk, Kerrigan astride his horse with firelight painting his sneer, rifle ready for another shot, and the Apache standing tall in the dirt with nothing in his hands but the spiral pendant, its gleam catching the last of the sun as though it carried its own flame. The woman clutched the plate to her chest, her heart a drum that threatened to break her ribs. But when she looked past fear, she saw what no insult could bury. A circle carved into the dust where bread had once been shared, a circle that had turned mockery into witness. Kerrigan spat into the fire and growled, "One trinket doesn't change the law of blood. She's mine, and you'll die trying to keep her." He raised the rifle. But before he could fire, the blacksmith's daughter stepped from the line of onlookers, her hands empty but her chin high. "She's not yours," she said, her voice shaking but fierce. Behind her came the deacon's wife, the boy with wide eyes, then three more, until a knot of townsfolk stood between the outlaw and the woman, their silence breaking into murmured defiance. Kerrigan roared in fury and spurred his horse forward, but the Apache moved faster, seizing a brand torn from the burning storehouse, the spiral pendant clutched in his other hand. He hurled the flame into the dust at the horse's feet, smoke and sparks leaping high, and as the animal screamed and reared, Kerrigan's balance faltered. In that instant, the Apache stepped in, striking the rifle aside with the flat of his arm and driving Kerrigan into the dirt with a single, thunderous blow that rattled the ground. The outlaw scrambled, cursing, but the Apache planted his knee to his chest, pressing the spiral hard against Kerrigan's throat. "This debt is not yours," he said, voice low as stone grinding stone. "It was never yours." The crowd gasped, some whispering prayers, others staring as if seeing judgment itself. Kerrigan writhed, eyes wild, but when he spat again, no one laughed with him. No one moved to his side. Even his so-called men stepped back, shame softening into fear. The Apache rose at last, leaving Kerrigan heaving in the dust, beaten not by steel alone but by the town's silence, by the refusal of their eyes to bow any longer. He turned to the woman and held out the pendant, not as possession but as offering. She took it with trembling hands, and when her fingers closed around it, her knees gave way, not from weakness but from release. He knelt too. This warrior who had broken bread with her before all, and in that moment the street, once filled with jeers, now bowed to a silence so deep it remade her name. No longer dog, no longer nothing. She was witness to a promise fulfilled. She raised the bread plate high so all could see, her voice breaking into tears as she whispered, "We shared it." The words spread like sparks through dry grass, repeated by voices until the night rang with them, and Kerrigan, dragged away in chains, heard his own power vanish under their echo. The Apache stood, his shadow long across the fire-lit dust, and looked at her not with pity, not with claim, but with a steady respect that would outlast the town's memory. For Dusthaven had been remade that night, not by rifles or fear, but by the simplest act the frontier had ever known: one man sitting down, breaking bread, and sharing his plate. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more soul-deep stories here on Echoes of the West. They mocked her as less than human, but one act of bread broke their silence forever. If you had been there, would you have sat down beside her too?